Hello world. I was watching the James Bond film Dr. No from 1962 the other week. I had my first generation AirPods Pro from 2019 on, and I was watching on my iPad, just lazing around. It's free to watch at the moment on ITVX. There are quite a few Bond films there. And I can remember being an absolutely very tiny boy as a wee family back in the early 70s. My dad used to enjoy showing off poodles at dog shows, and as part of that they would go to people's houses and find dogs to breed with and whatever they did with dog show things. And I can remember them being at a house one night, and it must have been a public holiday, an Easter Sunday or a bank holiday Monday or something like that, because we only got Bond films on Christmas Day or special occasions back in the day. No such thing as video recorders, at least not for any average Joe. This would have been about 1974, 75. Didn't have video recorders, so you couldn't just stick one on whenever you felt like it. And this family that we were at, they put us in the lounge and there was a colour television film on, and it was James Bond Dr. No. And it was one of the first times that I had ever seen a colour TV in action, because we had a black and white at home. I'd heard on the grapevine, as it were, that we were going to be getting a colour TV quite soon, which I was really looking forward to. And I was just looking at this thing saying, wow, the colour's fantastic. And all of those sort of memories came back to me as I was watching this film, because, even just on my little 10-inch iPad Air, the colours were absolutely gorgeous. But the sound was the complete opposite. Mono, dull, lackluster, lacking in any kind of pizzazz or excitement. There's a reason for that. And so what I thought I would do today is present to you just some of the little noodlings that I've done around the internet. There are, if you look on YouTube on channels such as Adam Martin TV, he can be very detailed about even just tiny little aspects of the TV service that not only have we had in Britain but other countries as well throughout all of the decades. I just want to take a little overview of the home entertainment and the surround sound formats in particular that were going on as I was growing up, perhaps in another part, which I'll record in a couple of weeks' time, more modern formats, such as the Dolby digital formats. I'm going to sort of go up to 1991 today with you. It's going to be presented in a way that kids in year 6 or year 7 can understand. Nothing too scientific. A little bit of how it works, but mostly I'm going to be dealing with the social and historic side of what happened and how we get to enjoy the entertainment formats that we get at the cinema and at home today. It's going to be fun, believe it or not. We're going to have a nice time. I'm going to start you off with a brief timeline, which is going to lead us up to 1971. So on the 6th of October 1927, the first talkie, that means the first movie with sound, where you could actually hear what they were saying, called The Jazz Singer, was released in black and white and in mono. In other words, all the sound came out of one speaker ahead of you. So that meant that it all, if you were listening on headphones, it would all seem to come from the same place in the middle of your head. Not ideal for the cinema, but we'll come on to all of that later. If you're at home, no TV, so there was just no alternative at this time for people at home to be able to watch something, they had to either turn the radio on. The radio in the UK had been broadcasting from London, from the BBC, since 1922. So it's just 103 years old now. But other than that, in 1927, if they wanted to, they could go to the cinema to watch Pathé News, I think it would have been, and so they could watch films and other special interest things that they put on at the cinema. And the cinema was something that people could go to very cheaply back in the day, not like now. In 1934, I say this because a lot of people might think that The Wizard of Oz was the first Technicolor film, but it certainly wasn't. This was a musical called The Cat and the Fiddle, starring a lady called Jeanette MacDonald. It's in colour, but the sound is still mono, which is a bit of a shame because stereo, which we'll talk about in more detail later on, is a much more suitable format for music. In 1936, the first TV experiments, or the first TV experimental broadcast by the BBC were being conducted. There were two rival formats. One, John Logie Baird, who I feel a bit of a loyalty to. He's Scottish. I've got a lot of Scottish in my family. That didn't sound Scottish at all. And he also lived in Hastings, where I live, for a little bit, on the south coast of England. There are plaques and monuments to him here. It's called the birthplace of television. There's even a Wetherspoons named after him called the John Logie Baird. But Marconi, who are a much bigger concern than him, had a better system. And so what the BBC did was, in 1936 up to 1939, they used to broadcast a week at a time, so that if you had a TV set capable of receiving Baird, you'd get broadcast 1 week. If you had a Marconi style TV set and they weren't compatible, you could watch that for the next week, and then it would keep swapping backwards and forwards. By 1939 and the breakout of World War II, Marconi had won the format war, just simply because he had the better system. But it was Baird who I think put in all the groundwork before Marconi. TV was postponed during World War II, but just for completeness, The Wizard of Oz wasn't released until 1939. Certainly wasn't the first colour film. In fact, actually, there had been a very primitive form of colour introduced in 1917, just for like one experimental film. In 1946, after the war, TV returns to the UK with a vengeance, and it never goes away. Still, at this time, TVs in people's homes were not the priority. But by 1953, when the Queen was having her coronation, it was being televised by the BBC, and loads of people started to want TV sets. And this idea of renting the TV, because a TV back in the day would cost, and even just a very small sort of 10 or 12 inch TV would cost an absolute fortune, black and white, and you'd be paying the equivalent of a couple of £1,000 in today's money for a TV. So people rented them. But yeah, TV takes off, as it were, in 1953. In 1955, the BBC are conducting their first colour TV experiments. No, I've underlined experiments because they were experiments. We didn't see them. More experiments in stereo radio. Very strange by our standards experiments. What you had to do in this experiment that I saw on the BBC archive was to place your radio on one side of the room and your TV on the other, and sit in the middle of it, but sort of a few feet away, 2 feet 6 feet away, 2 meters, 6 feet away. And the TV would get what was going into the left channel and the radio would get what was going into the right channel, or possibly the other way around, but whatever, you then got this stereo effect. It must have been quite peculiar, but trains going through the middle of your lounge, people playing ping pong, tap dancers all over the place, and probably Dame Vera Lynn as well, singing in glorious stereo, which you couldn't have done during the war. But again, stereo radio needed, particularly FM stereo, needed a few years before the technology was to mature and for it to arrive in people's homes. 1962, 1963, the first James Bond film, Dr. No, in colour, was released. That was the film that got me going down this whole surround sound rabbit hole. And Doctor Who in 1963 was first aired on the BBC TV in mono and black and white. But notice now that stereo records are becoming more popular. Records are beginning to get dual releases, one in stereo and one in mono, the mono one being slightly cheaper. Notice how all of the sound technology so far is taking place in our homes. We're getting stereo experiments, for example. And in the cinema, it must have just been sort of quite a flat event to have A Hard Day's Night in mono. I think it's probably been remastered now or something for Dolby Digital or something, but back in the day, that's what it was. BBC Two was launched. It was a bit of a disaster because there was a huge power cut across parts of London, which meant that BBC Two had to come to you from a small office with some poor man that's just been thrown into an emergency situation, apologising to everybody, reading them the news, apologising to them again, then reading them the news, and BBC Two had to start proper the following night. In 1965, Help, the Beatles film, was released in colour and in mono, which must have helped a little bit. Colour TV, or colour films at any rate, not TV yet, we haven't got there yet, but colour films were starting to look really good by 65. In the home, this is really important. Remember, I've told you this. Dolby Laboratories had developed a system called A-type noise reduction, which helps when recording a sound onto tape to cut down noise and hiss, and it does it very gently and very subtly, and it's been tried out in studios and is quickly becoming the de rigueur standard for recording in studios. We're talking about the big reel-to-reel tape, multi-track tape and that sort of thing, because when you do get into the realms of 4-track and 8-track recording, you are building up tape hiss as you go along, particularly if you do things like the Beatles were doing on Sgt. Pepper, which was like recording 4 tracks, then copying those to a stereo track, recording 2 more tracks, then copying that whole lot to another stereo track. And each time you do that, you build up the possibility for noise, and A-type noise reduction really helped to keep that in check. In 1967, the BBC Two begins broadcasting in colour if you're lucky enough to have a colour TV, and colour TVs, go to the Retro Wow website. Colour TVs cost an absolute fortune, and so again it would be that if you'd taken out a rental deal for your black and white TV set, you might be eligible if you've kept up your payments and you've been with the, was it Granada TV Rentals or whoever for long enough, they might say yes, you're eligible for an upgrade to a new TV, and yes, it might be a colour one. In 1971, after a little bit of petitioning, Dolby persuaded the makers of the film A Clockwork Orange to record their film with Dolby A. But there's a but. So we're at 1971. You'll recall that in the recording studio, when they're recording records, this Dolby A noise reduction system was becoming very useful to cut out all sorts of hiss and unwanted noises. Now, what was the equivalent of that in movies? Well, it was a standard that had been developed right up in the early days of the talkie film. There was an organisation called the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. They stipulated a system whereby you just cut off very drastically the highest frequencies. Now, given that tape at the time couldn't record particularly high frequencies, couldn't record particularly low frequencies, over the years from in 1927, when the first talkie came out, I don't even think tape as such had been invented. It was the mid-30s, I think, where BASF invented the tape. We're talking the reel-to-reel tape now. Those formulations were very basic. They couldn't record particularly high frequencies. They couldn't record particularly low frequencies either. And to get rid of the extraneous noises which were perceived to be in the highest frequencies, you had to basically chop off everything above a certain frequency. It was quite an aggressive form of noise reduction. It was called the Academy curve, and it was used all the way up to and including 1971 and beyond. When A Clockwork Orange, the film, was being made, Dolby approached the filmmakers and said, would you like to try out recording with Dolby A for the noise reduction? And yes, A Clockwork Orange was recorded with this Dolby A system, which was a very much more refined way of filtering out unwanted buzzes and distortions and clicks and things like that that weren't meant to be heard. The frustrating thing was that the Academy of Motion Pictures and Arts and Sciences curve, which was still being used, was applied in cinemas on playback of this film, even though it had been recorded with Dolby A. And of course, Dolby A was studio only, so you didn't need anything special to play it back. Dolby A can be heard, or rather not heard, on all kinds of records, reel-to-reel tapes and things like that, dating right back to the mid-60s. It doesn't need any special thingies, but they were forced to use this Academy sound thing. However, Dolby persisted, and turns out that what a lot of cinemas and studios wanted was a way of showing films in stereo. And with that, Dolby Stereo was born. So folks, in this bit I'm going to be taking you through the typical speaker layout in a cinema that would have mono in it, then a stereo, and then a Dolby Stereo speaker layout. This is the screen. The trick, regardless of whatever sound system you have, is to try and make everybody on the screen look like they're speaking and that the voice is coming out of the right person's face at the right time. And this dialogue is absolutely essential, and we'll see how we can make that happen in a bit more detail later on. But here's a speaker. It's got two cones in this particular speaker. The top one is called the tweeter. It handles the high frequencies, the high sounds, such as birds singing, violins playing, an opera singer doing her highest notes, The lower speaker is larger. It's called a woofer, and that's for handling the deeper sounds such as foghorns on a steamliner or a bass guitar, that sort of thing. Now, this is the inside of that speaker, viewed sort of from a cutaway angle. I didn't make this drawing, it's from WikiHow. There's a magnet at the bottom end of the cone. The cone is made out of sort of, it's almost a bit like paper, sort of like a spongy, flexible form of paper. You do get some that are made out of metal. There's one called Kevlar. When an electric current is passed through the magnet, it makes the cone vibrate back and forth. And those vibrations are what we hear as sound coming out of the speaker. Okay, so I've got a white arrow there. That's the sound going toward the listener, who's there. And the grey arrow is the sound going away from the listener. I'll show you that in a little bit more detail. This isn't the best drawing that I could possibly do, but it shows the white area with the thick line around it is the sound as it's being propelled towards the listener. The grey area, now there isn't a grey cone facing the other way. That's just imagining the cone pumping in the opposite direction. And you can see that the sound is all fuzzy there. It's less distinct. You can't really tell where it is. This is the sound moving backwards and forwards. When the cone is being pumped forwards, the sound comes out towards us. When it is being pumped backwards, and this happens thousands and thousands of times a second, the sound is going away from us. And eventually you can see the journey that they'll take, because if you imagine throwing a pebble into a pond, you're going to get ripples that go out in the shape of a circle. The sound that is coming towards us is called in phase. The sound that is going away from us is called out of phase, and this is going to be really important later on. What we don't want is in phase sound and out of phase sound to ever meet up, because what happens is that the two then cancel each other out and the sound disappears. If you've ever just hooked up a speaker cone to a couple of wires and tried to play some sound through it, it's really thin, nasty, no treble, no bass. It's just a mess. So this is why we put speakers in a box. The box is deeper from front to back than it is wide, so that the out of phase sounds have further to go. They also have the walls of the box, which kind of breaks them up a bit, so that they never get to meet the in phase signal. And what they actually do is reinforce the sound a little bit. If you want bassier sound, put your speakers closer to the wall. If it's too bassy, move them into the room a bit. So here is our mono cinema. A little bit as they would have heard it, all the way through the 20s and 30s up to 1977, mono sound. With the speaker above the screen, it would be the width of the screen, so that the person whose ear I have drawn sitting in that place would get a perfect illusion of voices coming out from where they should be. However, if that person closed their eyes and concentrated on the sounds, they wouldn't be able to tell if that person moved around the room. They wouldn't be able to tell where the person coming in with the tea was coming in from, or if a car was driving past, they wouldn't be able to tell which direction it was going in, because all of that relies on visual cues with mono. So Dolby Stereo was born, and the first film that used Dolby Stereo was Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, in 1977. As everybody knows who hasn't been living under a rock for 50 years, it was an absolute blockbuster, partly due to its soundtrack, and that is what made more cinemas adopt the Dolby Stereo standard. So Dolby Stereo works a little bit like this. First of all, we have two speakers left and right, giving us a stereo image. So when they're out on set, it will be the correct mic placement, but they could then go into the studio and use their pan pots to position images in stereo, so that not only have we got these guys in front of us talking, but somebody, the butler coming in with a cup of tea on the left, and the car driving past, will all show up in the right place. Or at least they will for our person in the stereo sweet spot. As you can see, we've made like a sort of triangle, and the person sitting at the correct point of the triangle will get the best stereo position. So anybody sitting in these places is going to get a pretty odd experience, because either they're just too close altogether, they might be too close to the right hand speaker, or too close to the left hand speaker. Those ones in the bottom left are kissing, so they're not really bothered. But now imagine if, instead of the cine reel, which is what it would be, a 35mm cine reel, having just an ordinary left to right stereo track encoded on it, what if a piece of gubbins called a matrix, a Dolby surround matrix, could actually extract the dialogue from the soundtrack, and it does that by looking for sounds that are equal in volume and frequency on both the left and right hand side, which would normally appear in the center with a stereo set in your lounge, for example, but across the whole width of a cinema screen, that dialogue point is going to be very narrow. This matrix, what it does is it just sends anything of equal volume and frequency on both sides to a center speaker, which just makes it all a bit clearer. It can sound a bit weird. I was listening on headphones in stereo to a Lucy Worsley documentary about the Georgian kings, and there she was talking, and she had some classical ensemble in the background, and it was very much left and right. But what that matrix thing has done has left the left and right hand speakers just with environmental sounds. All of the important sounds are coming from the center as they were in mono, but now we have some extra cues as to where things are due to the left and right hand speakers. And as I say, that speaker will run the width of the screen. But there's more. Not only does this matrix extract the dialogue and send it to the center, not only does it leave us with all the environmental cues on the left and right, it also takes that left and right that has now just got the environmental cues on it and inverts the phase of it and sends that to speakers behind us. So that wherever you are in the theatre, you can't just be kissing away in the corner, because you're going to get a really immersive sound experience, and you're not going to want to concentrate on anything except what's going on the screen. It's not a real surround sound experience. You couldn't have a dinosaur creeping up behind you the way you can nowadays with the Dolby Atmos systems and stuff. But it was just immersive enough. You just felt like there was this idea. And because these speakers, the rear speakers, are not in line with the front speakers, and also they put a little delay, something like a 10 millisecond delay on them, so what comes out of those speakers doesn't come out at exactly the same time as the front speakers, so the sound waves never meet, they never cancel one another out. So it's just basically a little bit more three-dimensional than just stereo. As I say, the first film to use it in 1977 was A New Hope, and in 1991 Batman Returns was the last film to go to the cinemas in Dolby Stereo, because after that they changed to Dolby Digital 5.1. In the cinema we got Dolby Stereo. For the home, this was ideal for the home, because if you, as I say, like us in the 90s, had a telly that had this Dolby stereo decoder in it, you could play videos that were marked Dolby Surround. Dolby Surround was Dolby Stereo, but without the center speaker in the middle, which wouldn't matter in your living room. Dolby Pro-Logic was the full experience, so with the center speaker as well. You needed a stereo video recorder to get any kind of sense of it, but it was backward compatible, so even if you were using your 70s TV with your mono video, it would still give you a good sound. Some of my favourite films that have this Pro-Logic soundtrack on for video are Erin Brockovich, The Man in the Iron Mask, and War Games from 1983, and The Lost Boys from 1987, which all have excellent fake surround soundtracks, as it were, that they also sound brilliant just in stereo. That's all I've got for you today. Next time I'm going to be talking about how we got stereo TV in the UK. Thank you very much if you've watched this far. Really do appreciate it. Remember to like, subscribe, share if you dare, consider a super thanks down below, and I'll be your best friend. See you later. Bye bye.